Listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome to True Crime, the podcast that helps you find new, emerging, and undiscovered true crime podcasts. I'm Greg, the host and curator of True Crime. Today's episode is from Vintage Homicide. Vintage Homicide is historic true crime told by two forensic scientists. If you like today's episode, make sure to check out the episode description for links to subscribe. All right, let's get this show started.
Begin. This podcast is not intended to be an investigative report, and all opinions stated herein are opinions strictly from the hosts and are not affiliated with any law enforcement entity. This is a true crime podcast and may contain information that may be disturbing to some listeners. Audience discretion is advised. Welcome to Vintage Homicide, a true crime podcast being presented to you by two forensic scientists with a passion for the vintage lifestyle. We are your hosts, Ms. Ruby Wild and Miss Mayday. We will bring you historic murders with special insight into the era and the forensics involved to look back at what crime solving may have been like.
Hello, Miss Mayday. It's been a long time.
I know.
We've got to explain why it's been such a long time since I have seen Miss Mayday, and that is because we no longer work together.
Yes, we had some new developments happen.
Yes, you may have noticed this large hiatus, and Miss Mayday filling in for me while I was gone with the wonderful Casket Girls episodes. I now live in Tennessee. I moved cross country.
Yep, she finally did it. She finally got out.
So yeah, obviously when you move cross country, it takes a minute before your life gets settled again. And then while that's all happening, Miss Mayday went on an awesome boating adventure. And
I certainly did. That was great. That took me out for about a week.
Yep. And then, yeah, so it's just been, it's been a year already. 2023, man. It's taken us for some rides. So hopefully we are back to our regularly scheduled program. I don't plan on moving cross country again anytime soon. So, and I start my new job tomorrow. So fingers crossed, everything goes well.
Yes. So we're off on a new adventure.
Yes.
And very exciting.
Yes. And I'm still a forensic scientist. So that part's going nowhere.
Yeah. So we'll let you settle into your new job and we'll hear more about it as things start to progress and develop.
Yeah.
But I'm glad to be back. I'm glad to see you.
Yes. Yay. So anybody who was wondering, yes, we are still going to record, even though I now live over 2,000 miles away.
Yes. And that's, the wonderful thing about Zoom and these sort of remote capabilities now. We're able to continue doing this.
Yes, I love it. So hopefully you guys are happy to hear us back together because we're happy to be back together. And I want to jump right in with asking Miss Mayday, why do dogs love Chicago?
I don't know. Why?
Because they can visit Wiggly Field.
Oh, that's cute. At first, my mind went like, "Oh, is this a hot dog? The Chicago dog?"
I mean, yeah, it could have gone with wieners for sure.
Yeah,
and
adorable.
I had one more pun just because I can, because it's been a nice long break. So, Miss Mayday, did you hear about the Broadway musical based on puns?
No, what's that?
It's going to be a huge play on words.
Oh, okay. Oh, that was a good one.
So if you have not figured it out by now, we will be covering the true stories behind the musical Chicago. Just so you know, a lot of those stories were real. So it kind of all took place at the Chicago City Courthouse, which is the northeast corner of Clark and Randolph. But really, we're going to be focusing on the Cook County Jail that's in Chicago. It's got a section that used to be reserved for women, and that's where they would stand trial in the 1920s. And because it was such a hot spot for these women to go, it was called Murderous Row, which is kind of cool.
Right. Yeah. So I had to look into this, not very familiar with Chicago's jail system, but according to sources, the Cook County Jail is basically a really long-standing jail. It existed on the same site as it stands today, which is in South Lawndale. in the Chicago area. And it's been in the same site ever since the Great Chicago Fire back in 1871. So a really old prison, and major county prisoners were at that time generally not co-located. And that didn't happen until the closure of this other jail, which was called the Old Hubbard Street Criminal Court Building and Jail. And that occurred right around this time frame in the late 1920s. So yeah, that was the Cook County Jail. And then this murderous row kind of got coined because at this time in the 20s, I guess a lot of women were seemingly going crazy and murdering their lovers or husbands.
Yeah.
And so they had never encountered this before, having so many like female inmates. And so they had to set aside a section of the Cook County Jail in Chicago specifically reserved for women. And in 1924, apparently this was the place to be.
Yeah, and like it was such a place to be. Like, men would be sending these women flowers. They would help pay for their trials and their lawyers. They would propose to these murderesses. Mm-hmm. And the reason that we know all of this is we're going to start with the person who literally wrote the scene for everything that you're going to be hearing about today. That is Maureen Watkins. She was a reporter, a minister's daughter from Indiana. She moved to Chicago at the age of 28 in 1924. And Chicago, like, the reason that she did this is she knew she wanted to be a reporter, and Chicago was the place to go for crime, liquor, jazz. It was the roaring 20s, and Chicago was the end-all be-all. She was a writer and a playwright, and she actually was educated at Harvard. She started working at the Chicago Tribune and was assigned to Murderous Row at Cook County Jail. The reason that they assigned her is because she was a woman, and male writers, it was too boring for a man to cover Murderous Row. I bet they regretted their decision once Maureen got her teeth into this. Mm-hmm. So she only lightly sugarcoated her opinion in the articles that she thought the majority of the women on trial were guilty, that they found a way to play the system, that they used this system to win. And while there, she wrote many articles on the women. But after only 7 months, she moved to finish her degree at Yale. She then wrote a play called The Brave Little Women. That play later gets turned into Chicago, the Chicago that we are talking about. So Maureen took all of this experience from writing on Murderous Row and made the play Chicago. This play opened, I know, right?
That's kind of cool.
It's a fun little backstory on its own, and we haven't even gotten into the people that she had interviewed.
Right.
And the play opened on Broadway in 1926. It toured for 2 years. Then it was made into a silent movie in 1927. Then another movie called Roxie Hart in 1942, where Ginger Rogers played the lead.
Oh, cool.
Now, to finish up Maureen's story, because I don't want her tale getting lost in the rest of this, later in life, she actually never married, never had kids. Chicago was the most success she ever had in her life. And after her death in 1969, Bob Fosse, that's Bob Fosse, bought the rights to her play from her estate after having been rebuffed on the purchase by Maureen herself while she was still alive. He turned Chicago into the musical. And so he created Musical Chicago, a musical vaudeville, which opened on Broadway in 1975. 1996, it was revived, and finally made into the movie that chances are a lot of you have seen in 2002, starring Renee Zellweger and Catherine Zeta-Jones.
Okay.
So that's when it got turned into a musical, was by Bob Fosse.
Right. So it was a play prior to that on Broadway. And then after Bob Fosse won like kind of the rights to it from the estate, he creates the Chicago that we know, the musical.
Exactly.
Okay. And it's kind of cool that it all came from basically Maureen covering these jazz killings as they were known in the 1920s.
Were too good to cover.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of interesting because there was a whole term for this like class of female reporter. They were called sob sisters. And so there was multiple female reporters at the time covering these in Chicago at the time for the Chicago Tribune. So it wasn't just Maureen, and like they all collectively made a way for themselves, and they collectively were called sob sisters. So that was a fun little fact that I had found when I was doing a little background on Maureen.
I like it.
Yeah.
So we're going to jump right into the musical because I don't know. I never got to see the original play, so only have the musical to base things off of.
Right.
And the true story of some of the women behind the Cell Block Tango.
Right. So the Cell Block Tango is a song from this 1975 musical, Chicago. It was composed by John Kander, and the lyrics were written by Fred Ebb. And this song, everyone famously, if you have seen Chicago, there's like this kind of catchphrase. And it goes pop, six, squish, Cicero, Lipschitz. He had it coming. He had it coming. He only had himself to blame. If you had been there, if you had seen it, I bet you would have done the same. That's like kind of like the chorus that goes over and over. But what it's based on is the fact that these 6 women are in this annex, which is Murderous Row of the Cook County Jail. They explain why they're in jail. And all of them are standing trial, accused of killing their significant others. And so this "he had it coming" refrain throughout the number is basically them saying that they're justified in their actions. And then each murder suspect is identified with this particular word that punctuates the song. So pop, 6, squish, Cicero, Lipschitz. So those are the 6 women. Pop is the first woman. Her character is named Liz. And she states that she was driven to kill her husband, Bernie, when his bubblegum popping habit triggered her misophonia, I think it's called.
Oh, God, do I have that?
Yeah. You want to explain what it is?
Okay. I have it when somebody whistles. If you whistle near me, it takes every ounce of self-control I have to not punch you in the throat. And that is not an exaggeration. It is immediate rage when I hear somebody whistle. And so you can't help it. You can't help it. It's like it triggers something in your brain that just, it leads to an uncontrollable emotion. Right. And so, yeah, I totally 1000% empathize with this woman because too many people in the world, if you whistle, don't. Just don't. Trust me, not a single other soul in your life wants to hear you whistle. No, nobody does.
Yeah.
Yourself.
So
whistle alone at home.
Don't whistle in front of Mr. Wild. Yes. So that's what misophonia is. It's this phenomenon. It's not really like any sort of psychology thing. It's not on the DSM-5. It's just a reaction to sounds that range from annoyance to anger with possible activation of your fight or flight response. Mm-hmm. So a lot of common triggers are these oral sounds like loud breathing, chewing, swallowing, clicking sounds like keyboard tapping, finger tapping, even like pen clicking, and sounds associated with like fidgeting and movement or windshield wipers, for example. And these sounds are hated because they have to, they oftentimes have like a repetitive or sort of mundane sound to them. So this character, Liz, in Chicago, basically was triggered by the chewing gum. And she states that, quote, I took a shotgun from the wall and fired 2 warning shots into his head. End quote. So that was Liz, who was Pop. And then the second is a character named Annie Young, and she is 6. And 6 admits that after moving in with her husband, Ezekiel, she finds out and discovers that he's actually a member of the Young family from Salt Lake City, i.e., he is a Mormon polygamist. Mm-hmm. So he had 6 other wives that she had no knowledge about because he claimed that he was single during their courtship. So she poisons him with arsenic. And so that's 6. Squish is the third woman, June, who explains that her husband, Wilbur, had threateningly accused her of having an affair with the milkman. And so while she was cooking dinner, and he started going into this, rage of like, you're screwing the milkman, she takes the knife and stabs him to death in self-defense. And
he fell into her knife.
Correct. Yes. In the song, she says, he ran into my knife 10 times.
Yeah.
And the squish is basically the sound we think the knife made entering his body. So yeah, that's squish. And then is our character who doesn't speak English. She is a Hungarian ballerina in the musical. And she's the fourth woman accused of murdering a lover. And she is known as Caitlin or Hunyak Helinski, I think is pronounced that. She has no knowledge of why she's being held for trial. She relates her story in Hungarian, which I am not even about to pronounce this paragraph in Hungarian. So basically the translation is, what am I doing here? They say my famous lover held down my husband while I chopped off his head, but it's not true. I am innocent. I don't know why Uncle Sam says I did it. I tried to explain at the police station, but they didn't understand me. There's a part in the song in which Roxie, which is setting up the story for one of the main characters in Chicago, Roxie asks, yeah, but did you do it? And she says, not guilty. So that's why this character is known as and we'll talk a little bit more about her later. And then Cicero is the fifth woman, which is a character named Velma Kelly. And she's also one of the stars of the musical. And she basically says that she catches her husband, Charlie, doing provocative aerobatics maneuver known as the number 17, the spread eagle, and that's her husband and her sister, basically. So she catches them having an affair, and at a club, I guess, that was named Cicero in Cicero, Illinois.
I think so.
Yeah. And so she claims that she sees them performing the number 17, and then she has amnesia. So she doesn't know what happens, but then when she comes to, she has blood on her hands. And so she's basically, it implies that she killed them in a fit of blind rage, like a passion murder.
Yeah.
So that's what Cicero is, based on this character called Velma Kelly. And then Lipschitz is referring to the sixth and final woman named Mona Lipschitz, who admits to killing her husband Alvin after finding out that he was bisexual and that he was cheating on her with several women and at least one male. So she goes through and starts naming like Ruth, Gladys, Rosemary, and Irving, and like off into a rage. So that's who Lipschitz is. So these are the characters. And
correct.
In the Chicago musical, they were basically based off of actual women who were murderesses on Murderess Row.
And we're only covering a couple because some of them I couldn't figure out who they were based off of. And, you know, it may be writer's liberty, if you will. Which I couldn't quite figure it out. But we're going to start with the Hungarian ballerina Hunyak. And she actually that character is based on an Italian immigrant from the town of Bari, Italy. She spoke no English. Her husband, Francisco Frank Needy, was an Italian truck farmer. Like, I wrote truck farmer.
Okay. So he farms trucks.
I don't know why I wrote truck. He was an Italian farmer, and I wrote truck in there for Lord only knows what reason.
Okay.
I'm sure it's like some sort of vegetable that I was supposed to write, and it's a typo, but whatever.
Okay.
So
he's a farmer.
Yeah, he's a farmer, an Italian farmer. So he operated a small tract of land near Stickney in Cook County. And on July 29th, 1922, he went missing. And he was last seen by Mike Travaglio. Yeah. And he had seen Frank selling vegetables at the Randolph Street Market in Chicago at 7 a.m. on Saturday morning. So police immediately went to the home that he resided in with his wife, and they arrested the couple's son, Charles, along with a farmhand named Peter Crudell, who lived with the family, and Isabella herself, his wife. All three were arrested for the murder of Frank after his disappearance, but were released after only a few weeks because there was no body. And, corpus delictum or corpus delicti or...
Yes, corpus delicti. It's a common law Latin phrase that translates to literally body of the crime.
You're listening to an episode of Vintage Homicide on True Crime by Indie Drop-In. We're going to take a quick break. And now back to this episode of Vintage Homicide.
So the phrase generally refers to the principle that no one should be convicted of a crime without sufficient evidence that the crime actually occurred. And usually in a homicide, body is that evidence. And the rule began in part to prevent the government from punishing individuals for crimes solely based off of confessions, because many of confessions were false or coerced, right?
Right.
So it was a protection that you needed to have additional corroborating evidence, and you couldn't just try somebody based on a confession alone. So in modern practice, this corpus delicti requires governments to have enough evidence, including physical evidence, showing that essential parts of the crime occurred before they could even charge an individual. So we see this, when you go to file, right?
Yeah.
The prosecutors will go ahead and they work with the detectives and law enforcement, and they go to file, usually with the county DA's office, and they have to assess whether or not there's enough sufficient evidence to take this person and stand trial for this crime.
Right. So because of corpus delicti, they were free. But that was only until his body was found May 9th, 1923. So he was missing for almost a year? Yeah, almost a year.
Yeah.
Just shy of it, like 10 months.
Okay.
So the only reason he was identified is there was people who claimed it was his body. So it was so decayed, there was no flesh left on the face or the front of the body from the waist up. And there was little flesh left on the back of the torso. So the lower half of his body was protected by pants that were still on him and one shoe. The other shoe was found in a catch basin. And the hand bones were found at the bottom of the basin. One was wearing a ring, one of those bones. So the coroner's physician declared that the injury to the skull, it was done by one strike to the temple with unknown object. It was a fracture extending back about 3 to 4 inches and also towards the forehead. So basically, like when you crack an egg on a counter, how it breaks in 2 different directions, that's what he's saying happened to the head. His nose was broken, his front teeth were missing, the bones of the skull and were bloodstained, and there was an accumulation of clotted blood in the skull. So that means that it was brain bleeding.
Yeah, there was like a hematoma or something.
You're correct. So the body skull had been fractured by a blunt instrument. It was about 1.25 inches diameter. It was determined that the skeleton was that of a man who was between 25 and 50 years old and weighed around 145 pounds at 5 foot 4 inches tall.
That's so a huge range.
It really
Somebody
is.
who's 25 to 50 years old.
It could be a son, it could be a father. Who knows?
It could be a lot of people. I'm pretty certain at this time with the mob activity, because this is Prohibition era, Chicago. This could be any number of
literally
people.
Yeah. So they relied instead on identification of not the actual remains, but the clothing, the shoes. So, because keep in mind, people didn't have numerous shoes back then. It wasn't like how it is now. They had 1, maybe 2 pairs if they were lucky. So the shoes were identified by one person who said they are definitely Frank's shoes. The shoes were tan with standard laces. There was no distinguishing characteristics on the shoe. So this one person that's yep, they're them. But again, how many manufacturing brands were present in Chicago in 1922? Right. So that was kind of, a little bit wishy-washy. So now we have to introduce some other people. So Isabella and Frank had children. As you remember, Charles was arrested. Now we have another child, a son, James, who originally owned the ring that Frank was wearing, or one that he wore. So as James was wearing it, it had a red stone, but the setting broke. So Frank took the ring and he just hammered down the prongs. So what would have held the jewel, he just like flattened them out. So there was no longer room for a stone to be. And so that is actually kind of a distinctive ring, if you think about it.
Yeah, for sure.
Personally altered, things like that. So James, who hadn't seen his father for at least a year before he went missing, was the one who ID'd the ring that was on the finger bones. And he said that ring is definitely the one that Frank would wear. The reason that Frank wore the ring is because when it broke, James was frustrated and he threw the ring into the yard, and his dad went and got it and fixed it, quote unquote. And then he was like, well, you got rid of it, so now I'm going to wear it.
Mm-hmm.
So now when the body found, things changed. So the trio was arrested again. And this time, Charles, the son, not James' son, other son, he sang like a canary.
Okay.
Yeah. So they were all interviewed in Italian. And when Charles was asked who killed Frank, he said his mother and Peter. When Isabella was questioned, all she said was, whatever Charlie said is true. However, during the trial, she said that she never said this, that she was confused as everyone was speaking English and Italian to her. So she's like, it could have been an interview tactic, who actually knows, where they just kept like making her think that she understood by commingling Italian and English when they were interviewing her.
Yeah. So to get like a positive response, they said something truthful in Italian, but then said something in English that she wouldn't understand. And then she just continued to agree. Maybe.
Exactly. And that's kind of what she was saying. Peter denied killing Frank, stated that he was home on the day that Frank was murdered. So now Charles, the son, he said that his father was asleep under a wagon, and Peter walked up to him with a hammer and struck him on the head in full view of his mother. Then his mom and Peter lifted Frank's body into the wagon, hauled the body down to the drainage ditch, dumped him in the water, where he was found almost a year later.
Mm-hmm.
Now, while Frank was missing, Isabella, she waited 9 months for her husband to reappear. And when he didn't, she married Peter. So he goes missing. The trio get arrested. They all get released. She waits 9 more months. Body of Frank still never found. So she's like, must be dead. So I'm going to marry Peter.
Okay.
And she said that she waited that long, that they were never intimate before that they waited until after their marriage to have a relationship, as in they were not having a relationship at the time that Frank went missing.
Okay.
Is what she was insinuating.
Okay.
Now, someone specifically, a woman, Anna Volpe, said that the two had a relationship and Frank found out. Now, Isabella said that she waited 1 week to report her husband missing because she thought he just left her. No one had seen or heard from him. It was then that she went to the police. So why would Frank leave her if she wasn't getting busy with Peter?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, why would she think that he would abandon her?
Right.
So this is like, it's a bunch of he said, she said kind of things happening. Who knows?
But a lot of it is circumstantial and none of it is actual physical evidence.
Exactly.
Okay.
So during the trial, the defense attorney was admonished as stating that he was trying to admit hearsay testimony that was doing nothing but damning his own client. So it worked out that the lawyer was so incompetent, especially in the eyes of the judge himself, that even though she was sentenced to death by hanging by the 12 male jurors,
he was not convinced by like the defense's ability to have done his job.
Right. The judge was like, you are so incompetent that these jurors had no option other than to convict her. And this could have been also, so I said 12 male jurors, and that's because in the 1920s, women weren't allowed to serve on a jury.
Right.
Our feeble minds just couldn't do it.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. I actually went and looked into this because I found it just interesting fact. Like, I mean, I knew this. I knew women didn't serve on juries, but I didn't know when women actually were granted the ability to start serving on juries. And the answer, turns out, is that it differed and varied from state to state. There wasn't like one federal thing that gave all women everywhere the ability to serve on a jury. It was dependent on the state and when the state decided that they were going to allow it. So just for context, we are in the 1920s and it's just 4 years after the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote.
Right.
So all male juries still had a hard time believing that women could be cold-blooded killers. especially white, attractive women.
Yes.
So what ends up spurring the ability for women to serve on juries is really the 19th Amendment and the women's suffrage movement. So when women were given the right to vote, they were pushing also for jury rights in all the states.
Right.
So you see kind of this combination of women's rights starting to increase across the different states. However, Illinois didn't allow women to serve on juries until 1939. And that is most likely because of the Great Depression. So when the Great Depression then struck the nation in the 30s, organizations like the Federal Grand Jury Association, which was a voluntary association of present and former grand jurors in the Southern District, they began to expand their requirement for those who could serve on juries to keep working men in their positions.
Oh.
So because it was the Depression, we had to have, workers.
Yeah.
And most of these workers were laborers and they were men.
Right. Right.
So who are going to serve on juries? And so this was like, hey, here's a novel idea. How about we let women on juries?
Right. So that way the men can stay working.
Right. Because they didn't have enough people to serve as jurors in courts. So that's when women started, a lot of states started actually slackening on their policies and allowing women to serve on juries. And by the 1930s and 40s, this meant that a lot of middle-class women demanded to serve on juries as a right of equal citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
And so League of Women Voters and the National Women's Party, they demanded this. And so kind of with the suffrage movement and these women who were advocating and being activists, pushing for sort of the right to serve on a jury, and then the Great Depression, all of these things combined, states started allowing women to serve on juries. But then again, this narrowed the female pool to only middle-class women.
Right.
So,
I mean, baby steps.
So we start seeing this kind of become more common in the 30s.
Yeah, it was just crazy. I didn't realize the history of women serving on juries either. I guess I just always taken it for granted that I still have never served on one, but it's not for lack of trying. But whatever. Maybe now that I live in Tennessee, they want me.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, you did move, and usually jury summons kind of come when you move to new places.
My problem is I get the summons and I show up and then they're like, no, bye.
Yeah, it's kind of rough because we work in criminal justice, basically. Yes. So, okay. So the 12 male jurors kind of becomes significant as to what happens here in these cases of these female murders, because the men were just kind of biased by the fact that they were women.
Well, and the reason that it's assumed that these 12 male jurors might have been harder on Isabella because she wasn't the upper middle class white woman, alleged murderess, gorgeous woman. So her trial, she was sentenced to death July 9th of 1923, was to be hanged October 12th. But Isabella, who was in the courtroom during this time, had no idea what happened until somebody translated what happened to her the next day. Mm-hmm. So she didn't even know that she was sentenced to death until the following day. Now, If you look at any of the news articles from that time, she was, quote, dirty, disheveled woman, quote, cruel, dirty, repulsive. So the Chicago Daily Tribune, July 10th, 1923 reporter Genevieve Forbes wrote that she was sentenced to death as a husband killer and that she was, quote, dumb, crouching, animal-like Italian peasant. Ouch.
Right. Yeah.
And then another one, quote, Nitty ran stubby fingers where dirt was ingrained into her broken nails and into her matted hair. She shifted her stocky legs and smoothed out a dark blue maid skirt made for work in the field.
Mm-hmm.
Another quote, twisted her face in a grotesque angle of fear and inferiority and cruelty and hope. Are you? These are quotes from the time.
Yeah, by this other female reporter.
Yeah.
And sisters, I guess.
Exactly. And so because this is also how the 12 male jurors viewed her, you could see why they weren't swayed by her at this time. So she was the first woman sentenced to hang in Chicago. But now enter heroine female lawyer Helen Cerise.
Yeah, I think we're going to go with Cerise.
Okay. I was like, Cerise? I don't know.
Yeah. So Helen, okay, so where we are at the story is that Isabella is sentenced to hang.
Yes.
And at this time, Helen Cerise, which is a young, sympathetic attorney, she steps in to defend this Italian immigrant. She assists in the appeal of this case to the Illinois Supreme Court. So a little background on Helen. She was born in 1899. And in 1921, she was the youngest woman in Illinois to receive her law license.
Atta girl.
Yeah. She has a long career. Her career lasts for a total of 62 years. And during her career, she campaigns for the right for women to become jurors. So this is kind of how finally in 1939, Chicago and Illinois as a state allows women to become jurors. In 1930, she was elected as president of the Women's Bar Association of Illinois. In 1939, she was also elected as president of the National Association of Women Lawyers. So she's very prolific as a lawyer. And she becomes the first woman president of the Western Suburban Bar Association in 1949. So during all this, she also gets married. She marries a man named Harry Henry Honeywell in 1931.
That's a fun name.
I know. It's like Triple H.
I like it.
Kind of a rhymey. Yeah. And she ultimately ends up dying in 1983 in Florida. So she lives a long life and she does quite a lot for women's rights, especially as a lawyer.
Correct.
But so back to Isabella Nitty's case. So Isabella Nitty's case was trouble from the get-go, as you kind of alluded to with the problems with her defense attorney.
Mm-hmm.
So in reality, the evidence was all circumstantial. The body that was found was never really proven to be Francesco Nitti or Frank, right? It was just sort of like, we kind of recognize certain things on his clothing, so we think it's him.
Right.
And he basically just disappears from their farm, right, back in July of 1922. And he apparently disappears as well as the family savings of $300. So it wasn't just him, but it was also the entire family savings.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of like, did he disappear or did he just take off?
Right.
So,
especially knowing that his wife was having the affair, or allegedly.
Right. And then in Chicago at this time, as you had mentioned, they were not very successful at convicting women murderers. So Cook County had never sentenced a woman to death. But the prosecution was really hungry for a win. And because Isabella was an easy target, because she didn't fit the American standard for beauty in the 1920s, and she was from a lower socioeconomic status because she was an immigrant, right? It was very easy to basically sway the jury into convicting her. So the one good thing that her lousy defense attorney did do was file this appeal. And so when he filed the appeal and Isabella's appeal process started, a group of lawyers banded together to help her and take over her and Peter Crudell's defense, which was the farmhand that she later then, I guess, marries. And so Helen is a part of this team. Okay, so with Isabella being an immigrant, her appearance basically when she's first arrested matches the prosecution's story in the sense that she was disheveled. She looked kind of like an animal.
I mean, she was a farmer's wife. Come on. Like, what does she have to... I don't get, like, I don't look dressed to the nines every day of the week. I mean, I look like a bridge troll half the time.
But I guess to the society at the time in Chicago and the jurors, they assessed her based on her appearance. And her appearance is that she looks like she's a savage. So it's very capable of doing the things that she was alleged of doing, right?
Yeah.
So it took this female lawyer, Helen, which was, again, rare at the time, to recognize this issue and address this issue. So it basically led to female defendants having agency and learning to dress the parts that they needed to play in court. Of course, the whole system would have been better if we didn't have to deal with these stereotypes, but it was disproportionately hurting poor women or women like Isabella who didn't fit the beauty standards.
Right.
So these women were dealing with the world as it was at the time rather than what it should have been, right? Without this discrimination.
Right.
So Helen and her colleagues helped Isabella kind of navigate the appeals process, and they provided a much more competent service than her original defense attorney, which I think his name was Moran.
I didn't even bother naming him because he was so pathetic.
Yeah. And apparently later he underwent like long-term treatment for mental illness. Like he legitimately was not a good lawyer because he had a mental illness apparently. But most importantly, what Helen did for Isabella was she gave her basically a makeover, right?
I mean, I want a makeover.
Yeah.
You're listening to an episode of Vintage Homicide on True Crime by Indie Drop-In. We're going to take a quick break. And now back to this episode of Vintage Homicide.
So I think the makeover basically consisted of getting her new clothes. She dyed her hair, taught her English, right?
Yeah.
And so from the papers, I think we'll go ahead and post some of her images of the before and maybe after from the newspaper clippings. So she had long gray hair and it was pulled back into a ponytail all the time because she worked on a farm. And she had rough hands because she was a laborer. This is what all led to the newspapers calling her basically an animal. What Helen did was give her this makeover, which cut her hair, right?
Into a bob.
Yes, which the bob was the style at the time that was in vogue, right? And the bob was kind of important because it symbolized independence of a woman, right? It was progressive, and strong women throughout history have been defined by this bob haircut. Prior to the 1920s, long hair was always seen as the feminine standard of beauty, right? Short hair was considered rebellious and undesirable. But during the 1920s, with the sort of women's suffrage movement and this prohibition era kind of leading to the flapper mentality, right? The decision to cut off one's hair was a liberating reaction to this kind of stodgier time, which was exemplified by the Gibson girl hair.
Yeah.
Right. Which was long flowing locks that were worn up, but always long. So she gave her a bob. She basically manicured her nails, made her dress in the style of a flapper, right?
Basically just made her a woman of the time.
Right.
Rather than immigrant farm girl.
Right. And then what was the outcome of this?
So while looking like a whole new woman, she was presented to the Supreme Court of Illinois, where she and Peter were granted a new trial, and they were both acquitted December 2nd, 1924, and set free. So this time when she was set free, the newspaper were calling her, quote, a butterfly.
Right.
Yeah. So now here's why we covered first, and that is because her trial let all the other ladies on Murderous Row know how important their appearance would be during their trials.
Right.
So it was this whole thing. So on to our next case, we will be covering Cicero.
Right. And did you want to go through the refrain from the song of the cell block Tango?
Sure. Okay, I ain't singing it.
No.
So my sister Veronica and I had this double act, and my husband Charlie traveled around with us. Now, for the last number in our act, we did these 20 acrobatic tricks in a row. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, splits, spread eagles, backflips, flip-flops, one right after the other. So this one night before the show, we're all down at Hotel Cicero. The three of us boozing, having a few laughs, and we ran out of ice. So I go to get some. I come back, open the door, and there's Veronica and Charlie doing number 17, the spread eagle. Well, I was in such a state of shock, I completely blacked out, can't remember a thing. It wasn't until later when I was washing the blood off my hands I even knew they were dead. This is the backstory of the character Velma Kelly. This was actually based on a woman, Belva Gartner, and she was born Belva Eleanor Businger in September of 1884 in Litchfield, Illinois. Her professional name was Bella Brown for when she was on stage as a cabaret singer. By the time we are introducing her, she had already been married and divorced 3 times. She was a stylish, wealthy woman from high society and was well respected in the community. This kind of changed a little when on March 11th, 1924, a married man named Walter Law was discovered at Belva's, having been shot and killed. Now, inside the car was an empty bottle of illegal gin and a gun that was missing 3 bullets. Police traced the owner of the vehicle to Belva, so it was in her car. Mm-hmm. And when they went to question her, she was found in her apartment, passed out in her bloody clothes. She said she was too drunk to remember what happened. The pair had been out the night before visiting a cabaret gin party. So police arrested her, took her off to Murderous Row. She was brought in drunk and blood-spattered, wearing only a slip after the murder. She was ruling cell block from day one. Keep in mind, she's like an elite society, this is how things are going to be done woman.
Yeah, and she was like really attractive for the time, right? And so, and she becomes extremely popular on Murderous Row.
Exactly. And like if you've watched the movie Chicago, you'll see Velma Kelly's character is definitely Queen Bee.
This is Catherine Zeta-Jones's character, right?
Correct.
Right.
So when she was interviewed about whether or not she killed Walter, and if so, was it a crime of passion, she, quote, said, "No woman can love a man enough to kill him. They aren't worth it because there will always be plenty more. Walter was just a kid, 29, and I'm 38. Why should I have worried whether he loved me or whether he left me? Gin and guns, either one is bad enough, but when together, they get you in a dickens of a mess, don't they?" So now when anybody asked about that night, she just kept responding, "I don't know, I was drunk." Her ex-husband, William Gartner, a wealthy industrialist, did pay for her defense team. Now, there were no witnesses to the crime, no evidence that directly connected her to the shooting. Her lawyers claimed that he shot himself in the front seat of her car in front of Belva, and terrified, she fled and blacked out. Walter, however, had friends. One was named Pale Lee Goodwin, who claimed that Walter told him that he feared Belva as she had threatened him. He also said that Walter told him that 3 weeks before he died, that Belva had locked him in her flat and threatened to kill him with a knife if he left. Again, hearsay.
So this guy is accusing basically of Belva being like a really jealous lover.
Correct. So after 6.5 hours, the 8 male jury ballot stated that she must not have done it, and she was acquitted June of 1924. Now, she remarried William, who was the one that paid for her defense team. He was 31 years older than her, and they got married in 1925. William, however, stated that she was an abusive alcoholic, and they divorced after a year when she threatened to kill him when he found her in bed with another man.
Yeah. So she was having an affair, and then she threatens to murder him.
Correct.
Okay.
So she also had a drunk driving charge in 1926. So with all these events happening, she moved to Europe, and eventually she went to live with her sister, Ethel Crusher.
Yeah.
In California, and she died at the age of 80, May 1965, from natural causes. So did she do it?
Yeah. Yeah. The world will never know.
I would be interested to see these blood-spattered clothes, because that would tell you a lot.
Yeah. And it's interesting that it seems like she had an angry streak.
Little bit. So now the next woman, it's not exactly a cell block tango woman, but she is definitely a main character. And of the song, We Both Reached for the Gun. So this is Roxie's story.
Right. Roxie Hart, right? This is the character who is played by Renee Zellweger.
Correct.
Right.
That little blonde pixie of a actress.
Yeah.
So Roxie was based off of Beulah Anand, who was born Beulah May Sheriff, and she was 23 from Owensboro, Kentucky. She married for the first time while still living in Kentucky to a man named Perry Stevens. I read in one source that the couple had a son together, but when their marriage didn't last after a year, she left the son in custody of her ex. So that's it. That's the whole story of that.
She just abandons Perry Stevens.
Correct. Okay, so she's now on her second marriage to Albert, who went by Al Anon, who was a car mechanic. The couple then moved to Chicago 1920. On April 3rd, 1924, Beulah called her husband and told him to come home because she had shot a man. What she did not tell him was that the man was her lover, Harry Kulstead. And while he was bleeding out on the bedroom floor for 4 hours, she listened to the song, a foxtrot called Hoolaloo, on repeat. That's just a fun name, Hoolaloo.
Yeah. So I looked into Hoolaloo because I've not heard of this song. And so I wanted to listen to what supposedly she was listening to while he was
listening to it for 4 hours straight. Did you find a copy of it?
I did. So this is this song's bizarre claim to fame. So Hoolaloo is a song, right, about a woman named Lou. A hula is a Hawaiian dance, right? Mm-hmm. And so Hoolaloo is a woman who wears a hula skirt. The catalog shows that there were at least 4 songs published between 1915 and 1924 that feature a woman named Hoolaloo in either the song or in the title, and all of them were published in the United States.
Okay.
And this lady known as Hoolaloo, the song is basically about how sailors love her.
Okay.
And how she's very well known among sailors, and she is not ashamed of the fact that she is well known among all these men. And she basically relishes in this idea that she is famous for basically her prowess.
Oh, maybe this is why she was listening to it on repeat.
I don't know, but
maybe she saw herself as a Hoolaloo.
Yeah, but apparently in 1924, this is the song to murder your lover by.
Oh.
And Beulah, right?
Yeah.
Just listens to the song and drinks cocktails.
For 4 hours.
Over and over.
Waited for him to bleed out and die.
Yeah. And this song is performed by a woman named Sophie Tucker. This is the version that I listened to.
Okay. I'm going to listen to it after this.
Yeah. And so this is where the lyrics come into play about this loose woman named Hoolaloo.
Okay.
And at the very end of the song, she says, something to the effect that this is Hoolaloo from Honolulu.
Okay.
Honolulu.
Okay.
Which is, it's indicating Honolulu, Hawaii.
Gotcha.
So, yeah.
Okay.
That's the song.
Okay, then. So now she met her lover at her job as a bookkeeper for Tenant's Model Laundry. He worked there as well. And it was after he definitely died, that was when she called her husband to tell him that she shot a man who tried to attack her. And she thought she would be raped. So this is that song, We Both Reached for the Gun. And
right. In the Cell Block Tango, when
correct.
Roxie says we both reached for the gun.
Yeah.
So self-defense.
Yeah, allegedly. And I can only picture her husband as, of course, the name just left, John C. Reilly, Mr. Cellophane Man. And I'm just like, oh, this poor sweet man. He doesn't know. So Beulah was beautiful, and she was questioned and taken into custody. She confessed to the shooting. She basically said, I did shoot the man, but I barely knew him. He broke in and he tried to assault me, and that's when I grabbed for the gun. And then they asked her, so why was he shot in the back?
Right.
So, well, now her story had to change a little, and she stated that Harry called her and said he was going out to buy wine and then headed over. And so the couple sat around drinking until it turned into a quarrel, with her snipping at him and calling him names. There was a revolver. It was Albert's revolver on the bed, and they both went for it. And she was able to get the gun first, and she shot him. Again, that doesn't explain why it was in the back.
Right.
Like he obviously was leaving.
Right.
So either way, a grand jury was held, and the stories stayed the same, and they just both went for the gun. That somehow explained
that was her story, and she's sticking to it.
Exactly. So she was ordered to be held in prison until the trial on murderous row. So now at the trial, she said that she had told Harry that she was pregnant. They struggled. They both reached for the gun on the bed. She got a hold of it and was able to shoot him. at her trial, it was noted that she was the most beautiful woman ever to be accused of murder in Chicago. And this is because she was young, thin, bobbed auburn hair, blue eyes, and a little button nose. And she dressed demurely and kept a look on her face of intelligence, leading all to believe that she was a really nice girl. So literally picture perfect.
Right.
I keep on thinking of Clara Bow. Like,
yeah.
Like picture Clara Bow sitting there.
It's that look, right, of this doe-eyed, demure.
Me.
Right. And if you look at the newspaper clippings from the day of her, she like posed for these photos.
Oh, completely. And like when interviewed by the papers at every opportunity, she was posing and she would rub her lips and pull her shoulders in and down, like to make herself look more fragile. And so the image proved irresistible. Thin, straight nose, high cheekbones, everything. It was, the quote, "The gorgeous red hair that rolled off her head like a prairie fire." And that was written by Douglas Perry in a book, The Girls of Murder City. But it said she had auburn hair, red hair.
Auburn is considered a red-brown.
Yeah. So now bookies were even betting on whether or not she would be convicted because it was a major trial at the time. Vegas bookies or whatever.
Right. And, I tried to look into factual evidence to support this, and I couldn't really find anything. But I feel like this very much would have been a real thing because these women that were in Cook County Jail on Murderous Row, all of the papers were so sensationalized. And it was literally in the Chicago musical where you kind of see that it's like this zoo of media attention. It was literally like that in
Give
Chicago.
them the razzle dazzle.
Yeah. And so
sorry, totally hit my mic.
And
I was doing my razzle dazzle.
Oh, with your jazz hands. Yes. So appropriate. Bob Fosse would be proud. So I think at the time this legitimately could have occurred. I think there would have been, because they were gambling in Chicago notoriously, right, during this Prohibition era. And
mobsters and
so I don't doubt that this actually happened, although I couldn't really find any sources to indicate that it actually did.
For fun's sake, we're going to say it did.
Yeah, it's a good story.
It is. And so while awaiting trial, she was on Murderous Row with the previous two ladies we've already talked about, and all three of them now knew the power of beauty and using the jury and their beauty to earn their favor. Yeah. And so Beulah's husband stood by her side, bankrupted himself to pay for her defense, and was there when she was acquitted May 25th, 1924, after the jury deliberated for only 2 hours. That day, she also publicly dumped her loving husband, Albert.
Oh, shame.
Yeah. Well, she announced that she left her husband because he's, quote, "he is too slow," meaning she wanted to live, and he was just content being at home. Yeah. And, oh, by the way, remember how she said that she was pregnant and that's what caused her lover to jump for the gun or whatever? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that baby never materialized.
Yeah, so she lied about that.
Correct.
Okay.
So she officially divorced Albert 2 years later, married her third husband, Edward Harlib, who was a boxer. And that was the following year. She divorced him because she said that he was cruel to her. She did not have a very long life after that, however, as she died from tuberculosis in 1928 at the age of 27 in Chicago Fresh Air Sanatorium. And she was transported back to her hometown of Kentucky for burial. Okay. So Beulah lived fast, died young.
So that was the story of Beulah, who inspired the character of Roxie Hart.
Okay. So this last one. Mm-hmm. Okay. This one frustrated me. They say that this is... Okay, I'm just going to jump in.
Go ahead.
The final one, I'm not buying that this character was based on a true killer, even though everybody says that it's, quote, loosely based. So in the movie, towards the end, Lucy Liu comes in as Kitty Baxter, who was the millionaire heiress, and she kills her husband and his two mistresses. Mm-hmm. And she is the one that overshadows the trials of Velma and Roxie, leading Roxie to make up the story that she's pregnant. So, okay, again, this movie came out 20 years ago. I'm not spoiling anything. You should have watched it by now, especially if you're going to listen to this episode, okay? This is how the movie goes.
Right.
So, they're saying This is based off of a woman named Catherine Balk Malm, quote unquote, the Wolf Woman. And she was an Austrian immigrant, moved to the US when she was 7. She had no accent. But basically, she was not an heiress. She was not like killing her lover. She wasn't doing any of this. It was...
The fact of the matter is that she was part of like some robbery group, right?
Yeah.
A group that was committing robberies across the city, right? And she's in Cook County Jail because there is a night watchman that gets murdered in an attempted robbery.
Yeah,
right?
Edward Keeman.
Yes. And this happens on November 5th, 1923.
Yeah.
And then total, there were 4 suspects, and 3 of them were arrested right away. Right. And those 3 individuals are herself, who is Catherine Malm, the Wolf Woman, a woman named Kitty. Right. But she goes by Blonde Kitty.
Yes.
But
because
in reality,
also went by Kitty.
Yeah. So this is where the confusion may have came in. And that woman's real name was Ethel Beck. And she was 18 at the time of the murder. Right.
Yeah.
And so she's Blonde Kitty. So there's Catherine, who's Kitty. And then Blonde Kitty, who's really Ethel, and then a man named Walter Bockelman.
Yes.
And so those 3 are arrested right away for the murder of night watchman Edward, right? Yeah. Keeman. Okay. So that's like the true story.
Yes.
That's the true story.
Yeah. And so like,
how does this inspire the story of the character Kitty Baxter in Chicago, right?
It doesn't. Other than the fact that this woman named Kitty happened to be on murderous row at the same time as these other stories.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah.
Now this Kitty, Catherine, she was found guilty, sentenced to life in prison. She died in 1932 from pneumonia at the age of 28. And one of the guys that was like the ringleader, Otto, sentenced to life. And the other 2, literally no documentation about what happened to them at all.
Yeah. So Otto was her husband, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And skipped over that part.
And they were like a couple that kind of did
like a
robberies.
Bonnie and Clyde. Yeah.
Yeah. They did robberies together, and then they joined up with these others on the night.
Actually really close to the story of Bonnie and Clyde.
Yeah. So it's kind of weird that they translated this somehow. I think this is where you're saying that it's like author, like fictional liberty.
Yeah.
Or like just trying to kind of go
a similar name.
Right. And so this is loosely, I guess, based off of Catherine Kitty. So it's interesting to me that they did find her guilty, right?
Yeah.
And she was sentenced to life in prison.
Yeah.
And I think this is probably because Kitty, like Isabella, was a little rough around the edges.
Yeah.
She was not as attractive. She had greasy hair. She had a sickly pallor, they say, which I think that's just paleness.
Yeah.
But not pale attractive, but pale like you look ill.
Right.
And she had shabby clothing. So that is kind of probably why the male jurors on her trial didn't see her as favorable like the other 2 who were a little bit more physically attractive. So unfortunately, she's one of the few that gets, sentenced. And she gets life in prison. So she didn't hang or anything.
But again, it didn't last that long because she died at 28. So, another one.
Okay.
But yeah, so I don't believe that, whatever. It is what it is. It's all fiction anyway, the movie. So,
yeah, but we do at least have at least 3 of the women in the musical of Chicago, which are pretty closely based on real women who served, who were in prison at the time on murderous row.
Correct.
Right.
So hopefully you enjoyed our musical dance down murderous row and you found it entertaining. Now, Miss Mayday, why do you never want to date a guy from Chicago?
Oh, I can give you a million reasons, but what is your reason?
Don't hate us, Chicago. Okay. The punchline is Illinois you.
Oh, that's actually quite accurate. Oh, that's a good one. I like that one.
Me.
Sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
So It is good to be back, and hopefully you guys enjoy us being back. And like I said, hopefully we continue to keep this regularly going again now that we're getting all settled.
Right. It was so good to see you, Miss Ruby Wild. Well, thank you for that.
Okay. And thank you. See you next week.
See you next week. Vintage Homicide is produced by J.H. Grawl. Additional editing and theme music produced by Matt Beck. A special thanks to Bonnie Navarro Photography and Bombshell Betty's Calendar. Please visit bombshellbettyscalendars.com for more information. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Vintage Homicide Podcast. Please subscribe wherever you prefer to download your podcasts and join us next time for more tantalizing tales of murder and mystery.
Thanks again for listening to True Crime by Indie Drop-In Network. If you would like to nominate a true crime podcast to be featured, just send me a tweet at Indie Drop-In. I'd also love to hear if one of our featured podcasts is now your favorite show. Indie Drop-In survives off ad revenue and listener donations. If you would like to contribute, please consider buying me a coffee. You can go to buymeacoffee.com/Indie Drop-In. If you look at the very bottom of the episode description, I put a link in there to make it really easy. Indie Drop-In has many other shows that you also might like. Just go to indiedropin.com. All right, see you next week.